What's going on, retro gaming fans, and welcome back to another episode of Rehab Gaming. So what we have here is the Nintendo Entertainment System controller, or gamepad, and as you can tell, it's got some duct tape at the top where the cable starts to go into the controller itself, so that tells us that there might be a break in that black coating on that cord. And then also it looks like this controller can use a good bit of cleaning. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to fix that controller cable. We're also going to get this all cleaned up, put back together, and make sure it's working exactly the way it should. Stay tuned, and we'll get right at it. So in preparation for fixing this controller cable, I actually anticipate having to cut the wires on the cable and desolder them from the main controller board inside. So I'm actually heating up my soldering iron, and I got everything prepared to do a little bit of soldering. And first of all, we're going to go ahead and take the screws out of the back of this controller. So for this controller, you're actually going to need a fine Phillips tip screwdriver to be able to get all 6 of those screws out on the backhand side. After we get those screws out, the casing will separate and will expose the main board of the controller. Now that we got those screws loosened up, we're going to go ahead and take the back cover off, dump out the screws, set them off to the side, just make sure you don't lose them. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and remove this main board. And then pull the cable out, and we're just going to set this whole assembly to the side for now. What I'm really interested in is the condition of the controller cable here underneath the duct tape. So we're going to go ahead and remove that duct tape. Now that we got that duct tape off of there, we can see exactly what we're dealing with. And it looks like, yes, this shielding was damaged, and then looking down in here, it looks like some of these wires were damaged as well. So we're actually going to cut the cable right here beside or behind where the duct tape was wrapped around the cable. And we're going to go ahead and start new. Since we made a nice clean cut, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and peel back the sheathing and expose the conductors underneath. As you can tell, you actually have some paper-like substance that's going to be on the underside of this black sheathing that are protecting these conductors. So when we strip it down, we're going to go ahead and remove that paper covering all the way back. And we're going to leave about, I'd say, 1 inch to 1.25 inches of wire sticking out of the end of the new controller connection that we're going to solder onto the board. So when you're looking at your board, you can see, let me get this to focus. It's actually labeled. So you have yellow, brown, red, orange, and white. So with this being labeled, it's actually going to help you out because you're not going to have to take a picture of this in order to remember which wires go where. Just make sure you follow the printed directions on the backhand side so you know which wire goes into what hole, and you make sure you put them in the right hole. Alright, so what I've done is I take a razor blade and I score the outside of the sheathing, and then I bend it back and forth until it starts to expose that paper layer. That's to protect the conductors underneath, just to make sure you don't cut too deep and you actually cut into those conductors down below. So when you bend it like this, it'll separate. And then you can just pull the entire sheathing off after you get everything worked out. And it'll slide right off like that. So this is about how much room we're going to need to work with. And then also these cables have a little bit of cordage on the inside as a form of strain relief. So when you're actually tugging on the cord, it doesn't put too much strain on the conductors underneath. And you're going to need to cut that off as well. Alrighty, and as you can see, it's about the exact same amount taken off. And when you're looking at this main board, how they originally place them in there, the wires are actually crimped into little studs, and those studs get pushed over to the back side of the board and soldered into place. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to put some flux on here, and we're going to take all the studs out, and instead of reusing the studs since they're crimped on here, we're just going to tin our cable, and we're going to put each of the conductors through the holes and solder them directly to the board. So there's a couple of different ways which you can desolder these pins from your controller board. You can either use a solder sucker like this, or you can use soldering wick like this. Either way will work. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and do both, and just to see how it's done with both methods of removing the solder. So we're going to go ahead and flip the board over, and we're going to prep our site for soldering. We're going to coat it in a generous amount of flux. Then we're going to take our soldering iron, kind of melt the flux in there. Just like so. Clean off your soldering iron tip. And what we're going to do in order to desolder, I know this sounds a little counterproductive, but we're going to add some new solder to these pins. That way the solder flows a lot better, and it'll make it a little easier to get all the solder off the board. Perfect. Clean off your soldering tip. And that's what it should look like. So for starters, what we're going to do is we're going to use the solder sucker on this very top pin. Heat up the solder, stick the sucker on there, and suck it all up. Now it'll get most of the solder out of here. However, you can have a little more remnants of the solder around the pin through this hole here. Clean off our soldering iron. And in order to clean that up, I always use solder wick anyways, so the solder wick will get around there. Just make sure you're watching what's called your dwell time. Dwell time is the time that your soldering iron tip is on top of whatever you're working with. So if this trace gets too hot, what it can do is it can actually lift up from the board if you stay on top of it too long with your soldering iron. Also, the soldering iron temperature plays a role in this as well. So if you have your soldering iron too hot, it will also lift this trace off the board, and then you'll have a lot more work ahead of you in order to fix that issue. So for the rest of them, I personally like using solder wick, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to use solder wick to get all of this other solder off of the board. I went ahead and prepped it with flux. The flux is going to help the solder get sucked up into the solder braid. And that's it. Wicking nicely into the braid, leaves you a nice clean post. We're going to take our tweezers, look at our posts, just kind of wiggle them back and forth just to make sure they're free. And we'll do that to every single one. Some of them might be a little stuck in there, so we'll go ahead and take care of those. So this one and this one feels like there's a little more solder in there, so we'll go ahead and hit that again with some solder wick. And we'll do the wiggle test again. So it looks like this one's being a little bit of a bugger. So we'll go further up on our wick. And wiggle it back and forth. And they should pull through to the other side of the board. You can cheat a little bit by using the tip of your soldering iron, putting it up against the base of the pin, and then pushing out with your soldering iron. We'll go ahead and do that to the rest of them. Now that we got all of the pins out, you can take a look at their holes. They are free. And we're going to go ahead and set the board off to the side, and we're going to get working on tinning the conductors of your cable. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to strip off about this much of the casing on your conductor all the way back on each wire, and then go ahead and dip that tip of the wire into a little bit of flux, put a little bit of solder on the tip of your soldering iron, and pre-tin the tips of your wires. So now we got all the conductors stripped back. We got them covered in flux, and we're just going to run soldering iron over the ends and deposit some solder on there. So we brought the board back, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take the conductors and stick them into their respective holes. Now that we have all of the conductors through, go ahead and rotate our handy hands around, making sure that the wires stay where they're supposed to go. And come back to this side. There we go. So now we have all our conductors where they're supposed to be. Take our soldering iron out, tin the tip up, deposit just a little bit of solder on the tip, and solder these into place. Now what you want to do is inspect each one of your solder joints to make sure that it wetted properly. Make sure you don't have any bridging. And then you can go ahead and snip off the tops of the wire with some side cutters. And personally, after I snip any leads or wire or anything like that, I just like to take the soldering iron, reflow it just a little touch, and what you should be left with are some nice connections that look like that. So now that all the soldering's done, we're going to go ahead and clean up the board to get all the flux out of here. Use 91 to 99% isopropyl alcohol works best. Just give the backside a good scrub because flux will come through the holes while you are soldering and desoldering the old wires. Then we clean off the front. Try and keep it away from this controller pad for one of the buttons as best as we can. And the reason why it's important to make sure you clean off all of your flux from your board is because flux is a corrosive and it can eat away at the traces over time on your board, and that's definitely something you don't want. Alright, so grab some 91% isopropyl alcohol and a Q-tip. Now personally, I use two different containers. I use one container for soldering, and then I have another container that's strictly for cleaning. And the reason why this is because when you are soldering and using a lot of flux, that flux can contaminate your bottle of isopropyl alcohol, and over time it becomes saturated in the alcohol itself. So if you use two different bottles, one for just general cleaning of contacts and then another bottle for your soldering cleanup and your flux cleanup, you won't run the risk of just smearing a whole bunch of thin layer of this flux all over the board, making it extremely sticky. So when flux becomes soluble in isopropyl alcohol and it dries, it becomes extremely sticky, kind of like the glue for a sticker. So to avoid that, I just use two different containers. Got those all clean. We're going to go ahead and set this off to the side and start to get working on our contact pads for our controller buttons. Here we have the front of the controller casing. We'll go ahead and take these contact pads out. Dump our buttons out. And then we'll just give these pads a good cleaning. Now that we got the contact pads all cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and direct our attention to each side of the controller casing. And what I like to use for cleaning the controller casing itself is a nice fine bristle toothbrush, and just get right at it. Now that we got the outside of the controller casing cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and clean up these buttons, and then we'll be ready to put it all back together. So for starters, put the buttons back in where they're supposed to go. Take the start and select contact pads, drop them in. Drop in the contact pads for your directional buttons. And the contact pads for your A and B button. Now she's ready for the board to go right on top. So, you line up the studs, make sure the studs go through the board where they're supposed to. And now we get to worry about rerouting this controller wire. So what we're going to do lay it into these two posts here, come up to here, curve it around here, and this is going to be extremely difficult since this is going to be a new wire that you're using, or at least wire that it's not used to being in this position. So make sure you hold everything down while you're trying to get it seated back in where the original wire was. And you may have to rotate your bundle of wire there just to make sure that you can get everything into place. Now this wire will want to lift up out of here just because it's not used to being in this position. So what you can do is let it out, then kind of restart this process again. Spin your bundle of wire a little bit. Squish it down in there. Then you take the back part of the controller, get everything all lined up, and quickly sandwich it together before the wire comes out. Like that. Now just hold the case together and put your screws back in. Now that this restoration is done, she's all put back together and she's ready to use. So thanks for joining us today as we tore apart this NES controller and fixed the cable. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit the like button down below. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Also, don't forget, you can also hit that bell notification to make sure that you don't miss out on any of the episodes that we put out. Also, if you'd like to follow us on Facebook, go ahead and do so at Rehab Gaming YT. And on our Facebook page, we share everything that we plan on doing for future episodes, ideas, some cool tips and tricks, and then also our Facebook page has a few groups associated to it. So if you'd like to get in contact with other retro gaming enthusiasts, or if you're looking for that one special game that you just can't find, check out those groups as well. So without further ado, thanks for stopping by, and we hope you have a wonderful day.